Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and I'm so happy that you're all here with us today for the webinar on life changes after the baby arrives. Congratulations to many of you who are here and have just had a baby or are expecting a baby soon. My name is Aditi Subramaniam, and I am actually calling in from Boston, Massachusetts in the United States. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and infant and early childhood mental health psychotherapist. My work involves working with really young children, like babies, and in the late preterm in the NICU, and doing a lot of systems level work focusing on developing social emotional capacities for young children. I'm really happy to be here. On a personal note, I'm also a parent of a 5-year-old, and so bring in some of the combination of my work experience and lived experience with all of you here today. I do want to take a minute to really thank the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority for making this initiative a reality. And I look forward to spending the next hour with all of you and hope that we could make it as interactive as possible. So before we jump into content, what we are going to do, I will name, is that through the time together, if you have questions or comments, feel free to please use the chat box, which is in your, if you hover around, you will see the chat box on your Zoom. And so if you could use the chat box, at the end, we will spend about half an hour for questions and answers. And so there is a Q&A box also. So if you have questions and answers that are coming up, feel free to type in your questions. Rest assured, we will be spending about half an hour looking at some content together, and then half an hour really getting to hear from you and looking at some questions together. So without further ado, I wanted to start to really talk about what might be some life changes after your baby arrives. So you're having a baby, congratulations, or you've already had a baby. And so welcome to the world for your little one and all the changes and the joys and all the feelings it brings into the forefront. So our hope today is to really spend time looking at parenting is a village and requires a village, and what happens for both the mother and the father in this transition to parenthood, and how do we really join with our babies who actually bring into the world their own amazing capacities that can help us then really enable and bolster this way of parenting. And so this is a beautiful quote that I have by Hardy, who says, "Nurturing itself needs to be nurtured." And I wanted to name this because parenting requires a village, and also wanted to name that right now that village looks really different because of the global pandemic. And so wanting to really hone in as you are here to really think about what are different and creative ways that this village of support or your social supports are there to support you as a parent, as a mother, as a father with your baby. So what is the transition to parenthood, right? And so the process of becoming parents is really a reworking of identities, both for the mother and the father, right? It's not just a shift in identity, it's not giving up a previous identity, but creating psychological space for your newborn, for your baby. And so for a mother, that might look like really reworking, moving from or creating space for being the daughter in a mother-daughter relationship to moving into becoming the mother in the mother-daughter relationship. It might be from moving from being an independent woman to becoming somebody who's actually has somebody dependent on them like a baby. And then with the parenting relationship, it moves from being a wife to being a co-parent, right? I'm parenting with my husband. And so these different identities are it's not just a switch, but it's really like opening up and creating space for it. So it's a new identity that's forming along with all the identities, and that requires work. It's not work that sometimes is explicit, it's what's happening in the process of transition to parenthood. And similarly for fathers, right? This is not just happening for mothers. For fathers also, the creation of psychological space for your baby, it's reorganizing your identities from being the father in a relationship from being a child in the relationship with your parents to now really being the father, to reworking what does it mean to be a co-parent with your wife. So really thinking about all these multiple ways that both as mothers and fathers in the process of parenthood or in the process of transitioning into parenthood, even before the newborn is born, right? It's thinking about some of these identity organizations that's happening actually even without us explicitly thinking about it. And so when we are holding in mind for fathers, right, what's happening, fathers have a unique, when we typically talk about transition to parenthood, the first thing comes around is always mothers. I do want to really highlight here that fathers are also going through their own process that has elements that are similar, but also completely unique, right? And so their unique experiences of what does it mean to be with my wife through conception, through pregnancy, through labor and birth, early parenting, all within the larger cultural context. And so, as fathers, really trying to figure out who is this baby, right? Who is my baby? The imagined baby, and like, who is this baby here? Feeling the process of getting more confident with really like caregiving practices, whether it's a diaper change, whether it is feeding, really thinking about how are my baby and I going to attach together? Like, is my baby going to feel a close bond with me? And then thinking about within everybody's own family culture, what are those values, right? What are some values I want to pass on to my child? And how do I do that? And so, new fathers do take time to feel comfortable in their role. However, that instant bond and connection, all this, our hope today is to really think about how is it that the babies really our baby promotes that process also and brings into the equation their capacities, their personhood, and it's really a back and forth in supporting parents into transition to parenthood. The other piece wanting to name for fathers is really relationships it's a reorganization of relationships with your wife also. And so really thinking about the relationship with the mom is also key. And, how do we rework our expectations, because it's going to look different in the initial transition to parenthood. So what are some key pieces that we're thinking about, right? As parents, what are some things we want to hold in mind, whether explicitly or internally, is the key things that both mothers and fathers are thinking about, like, is my baby well? Will my baby be healthy, right? My baby's health and growth being primary, that my baby and I are going to have a close bond. My baby will feel attached to me, that I'm able to form a close bond with my baby. Who's my village? Who are my informal supports? Grandparents, uncles, aunties, other parents who have had babies who bring their wisdom of parenting. And then reworking those identities that we spoke about previously, like reworking, am I going to be a good enough parent for my child? And when I say good enough, it really is the piece of like, there is no such thing called perfect parenting, right? It's really, parenting is a journey of learning back and forth from our baby and what we want to be able to support them with and how they show us what they're doing. And so when we say good enough, it really is that it's imperative to have an opportunity where not every time it's going to be a complete match in joining what our baby is showing us with their cues. But the goal is that when there is not a match, how do I, as a parent, listen to what my baby is showing through their behaviors, maybe not yet language, right? We're talking about a newborn, through their body, through their behaviors. And how do I then say, okay, we weren't able to match at that point, let's figure this out again. And so it's figuring out these identities again so these 4 primary tasks of what do I have to hold in mind as I am, as this baby is here, right? So really you see the holding of the baby. Through conception and pregnancy, there's wishes and fantasies of like, who might this baby be? What might they, not just the physical aspects of the baby, but really holding wishes for health of this baby, who this baby would be, what is their temperament might look like. And then the baby comes into this world, and then figuring out like, these were my wishes and fantasies of the baby through pregnancy, and there's this baby. And so it's really also joining and trying to reorganize a little bit of like meshing both those pieces of like the wished for baby and my baby, and the process of getting to know my baby who's here. And this is both for mothers and fathers. And so one of the biggest pieces, right? So we are thinking about is what is that piece of like connecting and bonding with my baby look like? We all parent from our experiences or feelings of experiences from being parented. And so a big part of connecting with our baby is reworking my relationships with my parents, right? From my early childhood. Some of it may not be really, again, explicitly like, oh, how did my mom do that? And how was I as a child? But as we parent, we are carrying with us generations of wisdom and generations of things that we might want to do a little differently. So it's both. And so thinking about how am I reworking my relationship with my parents, right? The baby's grandparents. Um, and then that brings up thoughts and feelings about me as a parent, me as a father, me as a mother, and thoughts and feelings about my baby. So really thinking about as we are every day in the back and forth of being with our newborn, really that back and forth allows us to really think about in nonverbal ways, right? The sophisticated, like baby does a little coo, and then, or even before the coo, there is a little cry, because crying is communication, right? They don't yet have words, but they have their bodies to show us all the things they do. And everything has meaning. All behaviors have meaning from babies. And so if there is a cry, as a parent, I respond a certain way. And so this constant back and forth that is happening is really creating a sophisticated dance, right? For the baby as they are growing and learning, and for the parent in figuring out, what is this parenting relationship going to look like? And inevitably, as we do that, we are going to have powerful feelings about things that how we were parented, about and powerful both positive and negative, right? And how do we hold and have ways to be supported as some of that comes up, because it is going to come up in the back and forth of parenting. And as it comes up, it actually is an opportunity to then even more sensitively attune to my baby. And so with that, when we're thinking about it, when we're talking about feelings and everything that's coming up that is going to get activated in this really early parenting relationship, is in the first few weeks. I'm sure most of you have heard this, but I do want to name that we all, as parents coming into the early parenting relationship, there's always going to be ambivalence, right? There's feelings of positive, there's feelings of like not so positive, and being able to share and create space for bringing up all feelings, right? Not just the really lovely feelings, but really being able to talk about how hard also it is, really actually creates space for some of that way of connecting and being able to be sensitively attuned to my baby. However, we also know that so the baby blues, right? So like the first few weeks of caring for a newborn, most moms and dads will feel like there could be a range of feelings that could be from like joy to anxiety to sadness to feeling overwhelmed to be exhausted, right? The real exhaustion, both bodily and emotionally. And so some of this is really, that's what's called baby blues. It typically gets better within the first few weeks, right? It's there for a couple of weeks. However, for some women and some men, and we'll talk first about women and then talk about for fathers, for some women, this might extend. And this might extend where it doesn't get as better. And so that's when you think about postpartum emotional complications, which you might have heard postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, is when these feelings actually don't go away after 2 weeks. And, it makes it harder for the mother to be able to care for their baby. I have to name postpartum depression is not anybody's fault. It is not a weakness on the mother or the woman. It is completely treatable. And I think wanting to really elevate that, I really having ways that there's a support for the mother through the process. And so treatment helps most women and men feel themselves back again, right? Like there's intervention would help. And this is beyond the baby blues. And similarly, for fathers, research shows that about 30% of fathers report some classic symptoms of some sort of depression after birth. It might not be 2 weeks after. it might be close to 6 months or a year after. And again, really having a way to be able to support the father with it, right? Whether it's really getting professional, formal help or formal supports, having ways of really having like parenting groups to be able to start to form for supports, prior. I'm curious right now with COVID, I know in the United States and in Massachusetts, at least, a lot of these parenting groups have become virtual, and it still is creating forums for families to be able to connect with one another in that really, my baby's here, and now what? And so, thinking for men, there is also an additional layer of socialization, right? As men, there's this piece of like, grappling with changes, whether like there's this underlying message that men are socialized to be strong, right? We don't have to show our weak feelings. And then really being able to think about that as the mom, that, fathers are meant to support their baby and their wife, and the mother. And yet fathers can also have really complicated feelings come up. And so wanting to really plug that, it's important to really think about, once it extends beyond the baby blues, to really think about, if it does for a certain, it's not for everyone, that it's completely treatable. And really seeking some formal supports is really important, because we all have ambivalent feelings. Really being able to create space for both the joys and the exhaustion and the feelings of like, what does this mean? And so as we're talking about this, right? So what is a buffer for something? What might be a little buffer for this is our babies are coming into this world with their own capacities. And so what we spoke earlier about, this dance of back and forth, right? This parenting is really an opportunity, with the baby being an active part of this relationship, right? Years ago, there's a lot of, research that said that babies come into this world like a blank slate. They come into this world and then they're shaped by their environment. We know now from a lot more research and community wisdom, I think these are things that families and parents knew and research picked up to, is that babies come into their world. They come into the world with their temperament, with their personhood, with capacities. They come with skills. And so really, how do we really join with and learn with our baby in order to support that back and forth piece? And so, again, naming that we parent from our experiences of how we were parented. Babies come into this world wired to connect, right? They're straight out into the world to be like, I am here to form relationships. And similarly, we are also hardwired for relationships. And the beautiful thing about relationships is that the more positive that we feel about a relationship, we want it more, right? Like it creates space for wanting it more. And so this, really thinking about, how do we do this? How do we do this dance of parenting back and forth, knowing that our babies come into the world ready to want to attach and create relationship and want to connect? And so what we do know about babies is that babies, their brains develop in the context of their earliest caregiving relationships. So not only as parents, we focus on the tasks of feeding and holding and, soothing, but it's all through those nurturing pieces that actually, it's not just that they are growing, it's actually impacting their brain development. And a little bit ahead, we'll watch a little video together, but their brains develop in the context of their relationships. And so as the mothers and fathers, your nurturing presence with them is really supporting and setting the stage for all other areas of development, whether it's their walking or their talking or their cognitive development or their thinking skill. Like all of that is starting from this relationship of like, how are they doing this? So, we already know that babies need physical presence to be able to, what that physical looks like is the piece of like holding, cooing, warmth, whether that is skin to skin, or that is nursing, or that's feeding, that's, any kind, like all those pieces of physical presence. And then there's nurturing presence. So it's really thinking about, but babies need both, right? Not just the physical, but it's a physical that is with nurturing care. Because what that is doing for the brain of your little baby is that's how I learn that I can trust the world and I'm loved, right? So an example is like, I cry as a baby and my parent responds with, for example, feeding. I know the more and more those patterns happen, whether it's feeding or I cry and my parent responds. And I know that every time I share something from my internal being, I'm responded to by my trusted early caregiving relationships. And what does that do in my brain is I'm learning as a sense of self that, oh, I can trust the world because when I have big feelings, my parents respond to me and I can trust the world. And as I learn to trust the world more, I deserve being loved, right? I feel loved. And so don't like for all of us, the core for what we want as parents for our children is their ability to say, I am loved, I can love, and I trust the world in order to explore it as I grow older and older. Right. And so your everyday tasks that feel like everyday tasks of like the rituals and the ways of being with your baby are really supporting who they are, like how they see the world, how they learn to trust the world. And so it's actually impacting not just their feeling of it but their brain size. And so children learn from this everyday experiences, right? The more this happens in a dance, the more they learn, like, oh yeah, I know my mom will respond to me when that happens. Oh, when I'm crying, I know my father will pick me up if it's really hard. Like, and so that back and forth creates, and there's no one way of it, right? This is also a way to really think about culturally, not just cultures of like America or India, but cultures of your family. How does this back and forth of parenting and this dance of back and forth of responding to your baby really look like and feel like in your particular family culture? And so, beyond even what is happening with that, is that it's also, we call this in your calm. So, if the baby were to use, this is really what, if babies were to use their voice, they'd say, in your calm, my parents, I find my calm. And eventually, we find our calm. I do want to say, as I say this, that it is not always very calming. Like the first few parts of parenting and the early weeks and early months, it's a lot of work and it's exhausting. And yet, in those little micro moments, right? So the newborn is born into this world as they bring capacities, but their biggest task is to learn to self-regulate, right? How do I figure out? How do I work my internal systems of like my heart rate, my breathing, my color change, my those are things that they're actively not, you can't see external, like you can't fully see externally. So they're working on that to be able to regulate color change and things in breathing you can actually feel externally as a parent also. Um, and then to be able to be like, I'm trying to regulate soothing. I'm trying to regulate when I get upset. And we know that babies don't do this on their own, right? Parents, you as mothers and fathers, are instrumental and key in helping babies learn to regulate, in helping babies learn to find their calm. I also usually give this example is, when, if so I'm going to give my example. For example, when my daughter was much younger, I think she must have been about like 2 months old. My mom was here with me, and she was crying, and at some point, everybody around my house was like, feed her, feed her, feed her. And I had to literally be like, no, let me try to soothe her differently. But as I realized that, as I was hearing everybody share their pieces of information, I was not very calm about it. And so I was getting more dysregulated internally, and that actually didn't help my little one, right? And so what are some ways that in those moments when we are responding to our baby, and in multiple ways, right? That could be feeding, it could be picking them up, it could be putting them on you, it could be talking to them, it could be just showing them your face. But in those moments, what do we do to be able to find our calm so that as we respond in calm, our baby is like, oh, my grown up around me is really giving me skills and helping me learn to regulate. And so, again, thinking about this not as just individual moments, of like ongoing, right? Ongoing experiences of this are ways to really support our baby in learning how to regulate. This doesn't just end in infancy, it goes all the way up to like early childhood. And so it's an ongoing process, right? The more and more experiences happen, the more and more they're learning skills. And so, how does this happen? How does this happen with newborns? And so, it happens with really thinking about feeding, holding in a sensitive, nurturing manner, learning and responding to the cues of my baby, right? And this is where, like, your baby is bringing and sharing their own cues. Like, when are they saying that I really need a break? I'm going to look at your face when I'm calm and quiet and alert. And then I'm taking all this information and I need a break. I'm going to look a little away. And then I'm going to come back when I'm ready. And really being able to like pause and join with your baby and learning and responding to their cues. You know, I want to really name some of this as parents is happening naturally. You are doing this already. The hope of today is to really like put a magnifying lens on like, oh, wow, all that I'm doing is actually really impacting who my baby is and what our relationship in parenting is together with my baby. And so this serve and return, right, this back and forth really creates this sophisticated dance of as I am learning to regulate from you, you are calm, I am calm. And now we have learned a new way of being. Um, Dr. Brazelton and Dr. Ed Tronick and Dr. Kevin Nugent, right? They really talk about what does this mutual regulation look like. So it's not just the baby regulating, the parent regulating, the baby regulating, and then together we have found a new dance. Now I know that when I'm crying and my mother responds to me in a certain way, the more experiences of that have happened, we have created a new way of being, right? And so then from there, there's more experience. And so it's pretty awesome if you think about it, and pretty sophisticated to think about how is this back and forth through everyday ways of ordinary moments of magic is how I feel like they're really ordinary moments of magic, but they're so nurturing. There's so much as parents you all are already doing with your baby that is really highlighting what's happening in their brain. And what your baby is sharing back, right? What your baby is bringing into the equation of who this particular baby is. So we are going to watch a very small video together about this serve and return. And Alex, would you mind sharing the video, please?
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to share my screen again. Right, and so the video that you saw is from the Center for the Developing Child, which is a part of Harvard University here in Massachusetts in the United States. And so, in the serve and return in the circuitry, I mean, feel free to use the chat if you have things that that are coming up for you as you watch that video. I do see somebody has sent something in the chat. Yes, I will make sure that the video details are with all of you. Right, so then when we think about what does it really look like? Oops, here we go. So what does it really look like in this back and forth of really paying attention to our infant and our baby's cues is really looking at how do we nurture the nurturer, right? How do we really support the parents and support mothers and fathers? Because whether that's through informal supports, right? Parenting groups, uncles, aunties, grandparents, neighbors. And as I say this, I know some of that looks really different right now with COVID around. And so would love if you all have thoughts of how are you navigating it right now during times of the pandemic. I would love to hear from you. And I'm sure your peers would love to hear from each other about what are some ways that you're navigating informal supports of your village as you're parenting your baby and your newborn. Or that might be formal supports and both, right? So are there more formal supports that are needed in order to support the parents? Peer supports, which is I'm sure like all of you being a part of parenting groups together or a parenting community together, because what does it do as we feel like we're nurturing the nurturer and have opportunities and space for parents to share their experiences is that it really hones into then creating space for really listening to our infants' cues. What is my baby showing me through their behaviors? What is my baby showing me in this moment that can then uniquely respond, that I can then uniquely respond as a parent to my baby, right? This is not the generic book of like every baby does this, but this is the like, yeah, babies go through, there is the like, this is not the milestones piece, but this is like, who is my baby? How is my baby showing me that I need a break? How is my baby showing me, oh, I'm in a quiet, calm, alert state. I'm ready to actually respond to you. I'm ready for your face. I might be ready for your voice. How is my baby showing me that I'm getting more, more upset. I'm fussy, and then I'm getting into more crying, and then what you are doing in order to soothe and support them, right? Um, oh, that's a great question, Pankaj. Any guidelines for forming supports groups? How to go for it? It's a great question. I think I would love. Let's come. We're very soon coming to the question answer piece, and so let's talk a little bit more about that. And so, really paying attention to like what is we need nurturing as parents as we nurture our youngest and our babies, because that allows us to then create space for paying attention to our baby's cues. All right, and so with that, we are going to do some questions. I wanted to again thank everybody here, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see your chat and your questions. All right, so Pankaj has a question that says, any guidelines for forming a support group? And I think that's a great question, and I think I want to be really mindful of what does it look like in your community, right? What does it look like in the UAE, and what are some opportunities that exist? I will share sometimes, like right now, specifically during COVID, those support groups have actually happened online, where it's either one is through an agency, right? That's more formal. The other has been where I've actually had families who have reached out on social media supports and created like a group where one of my brother and sister-in-law had baby recently, and baby was born during COVID, and they are actually a part of a small private support group of parents in Canada who are navigating being parents. And so nobody has seen each other, but they have this like forum where they're able to connect. I think in times of not COVID, I think there are ways of really thinking about how do we form support groups within our community. Like I think reaching out through either a I feel like I keep saying social media right now, I feel, because that's what's being elevated so much and what people use so much. But sometimes if there's like a local newspaper, if there's a local community, like a housing paper, that you could actually think about, how do we come together? Like, let's spend time talking about what your experience is, right? And it's not, if it's a peer support group, there are ways to really do this where it's really listening from one parent to the other. Like, what did you do? We do this already. Like, we reach out and be like, hi, I'm struggling with sleep. What are you doing? What did you do? Right? We do that already in different ways, from either our friends who have become parents or have parented, or from wisdom of people who have already parented generations before us. I think what a support group ends up doing, it just formalizes some of that, where it is more than you get voices of multiple ways of parents. The other piece is to try to think about other organizations within your community that are doing support groups for parents already. And I'm looking at Hara in the square here, but maybe Bright Start is having opportunities for something like an organization there to really think about how do you have support groups that can be created and then maybe facilitated by somebody not teaching, right? These are not teaching groups. They're not ways like do this and you will be. This is ways of really learning from wisdom where parents can share their experiences of being with their baby. I hope that was helpful, Pankaj. It's hard that I can't see any of you. So any other questions or comments or things that it reminds you of after our time together? I will give it a little bit because I know folks can. So one, you could either use the Q&A button at the bottom or the chat. There is also on Zoom a raise your hand. And you could raise your hand and then just unmute yourself, and then it would be great to hear your voice. I'll pause a little bit. I do see there's also not a question, but a comment about the video. We will make sure that the video is available for all of you with the relevant link. Give it a few more seconds and then I'm happy to share maybe a question or two that has come from some of the parenting work that we have done here in Boston. Perhaps a little more on fathers. Thank you, Kevin. And so, so it really opens up, right? When we think about parenting, what usually comes to mind is the mother. And we know that parenting is not just the mother, it's the mother and the father. And I would even go to say the extended community, right? Whether that is grandparents, the extended family. And so when you're thinking about fatherhood, so I think let's think about one, the transition to fatherhood, what that looks like. I do know there is another entire webinar on fatherhood engagement. And so I want to be mindful of giving opportunity to that one also. It's by our colleague, Joanna. And so, but really thinking about fatherhood, right? The transition of what does it mean to be a father? And this looks really different culture to culture. And we know that roles of fatherhood, right? I think about, so within the piece that we spoke about, what does this look like for fathers as they are reworking their identity with their mothers, with their fathers, of who they are, from moving from being the child to being the father. They are reworking, creating space in their relationship with their wife of this is going to look different. This is no longer 2, it's 3. And how do I create space for 3? The other piece, as mothers are reworking about their identities of like, are we going to create a close relationship? Am I going to create a close relationship with my baby? Fathers also then think about, are we going to be financially okay, right? Like there's this other whole piece, and I say that and want to name that looks really different in different cultures. And so thinking about even the piece of like, are we going to be okay? Are we going to be able to provide for? Am I going to be able to provide for my family unit? And so thinking about that layer that fathers are also thinking about. And then how am I supporting the mother and the baby, right? And as we do this, I can share an example in the work that I do in Boston, with late preterm babies, newborns in the NICU and in their homes, there have been really intentional ways to, by noticing what the baby is bringing, to actively not just do this with the mother, right? To really be able to show what your baby is bringing into the equation, and having actively the father's voice in, and have the father notice, like, what is this like for you, right? I think how many times do we, I remember years ago, I was in a talk where there was somebody who said, even when we go to a pediatrician, right, sometimes pediatricians will just turn to the mother and talk. And how do we actually actively include both fathers and mothers in the conversation? I think there's this piece of like, mothers get parenting naturally. It's not true, right? There's a different relationship because of the bodily experience of being with the baby. The process of parenting is really a process. And so as we think about that, which is why all the new research that talks about that postpartum is not something that only impacts mothers, impacts fathers too, and sometimes actually um, is rarely caught, or is usually let slide away. So the idea that fathers might have postpartum depression or emotional complications, I'm so grateful that now some of that work is being elevated, because usually it's been, it's been saying that only mothers go through it, but fathers also do. And how do we then, from the formal support piece, really also make sure that we're intervening and supporting fathers? Because as we know, the baby's brain and personhood and ways of trusting and loving in the world are coming from both those separate relationships, separate but together relationships of how they're parenting their baby. I hope that was helpful, Kevin. Are there any other questions or thoughts? Any other wonderings from anyone? I am reminded by Pankaj's question on the formal support group. We were in a discussion a few months ago here, where actually there were studies that actually said that parents, who do they trust the most in getting information, is actually peers, is other families. Like, who do they go to? I mean, they trust pediatricians and trust authority in different ways, but who do they go to first to learn about everyday parenting practices? Is peers. And so just wanting to highlight that, as I was reading that question, that came to mind. And I wonder whether maybe sharing a little bit about infant cues, right? How is my baby showing me all the capacities that they bring, like all the things I can do and all the things I'm continuing to work towards? And really thinking about the newborn as they come into this world, right? Some of you, really thinking about, like, how did they feel like in you, right? How did they feel through your pregnancy? And then they're out in this world, and the capacity is your baby, your newborn, the first hour that they bring in, right, in their way of how they are given that task that they're doing is really regulating, right? They have to like that learning, constant learning of how do I regulate? How do I regulate my body temperature? How do I regulate my heartbeat? How do I regulate my breathing patterns? How do I regulate when there's stress? Do I show it through, and stress in the sense of like, anything that feels a little too much, right? We're not talking about the beyond typical stress. We're talking about just light, sound. How am I protecting my sleep, right? Am I able to shut it out in this moment? Am I showing you that I'm working really hard to shut it out by like cringing my eyes, changing my color of my body, actually maybe rousing and waking up? And none of this is a good or a bad. It's not a test, right? It's really that my particular baby brings into the world the way they are showing you how do I work at regulation. And then, as the beauty of it is in that back and forth of parenting, right? If my baby is showing me that, oh, a lot of sounds around me, it's harder for me to right now shut it out. As a parent, by really paying attention to their cues, what my baby is saying is like, oh, I this is hard for me right now, and I'm showing you through changing my color and actually like not being able to be in my sleep state. I will then be able to, as a parent, potentially be like, all right, maybe my baby needs like a quieter space right now, right? And I say right now because time is really different for babies. They change, and they're learning their capacities. As capacities keep growing, some of those pieces are going to look different. So in this moment, my baby is saying that I don't want the TV around. I'm finding it harder when my sibling is screaming around me. And so, can we find a quieter place for me to sleep? Right? That might change over time. But in that back and forth of noticing these little cues of how my baby is showing me that this is hard or this is what I can do, right? Oh, you can keep everything on and I'll still sleep. You can have you can have like the truck outside, the window open, and I'm pretty okay. I got this. Um, or or I'm working at it, but it's still I'm not going to wake up and it's all right. It's a different way of then being like, all right, so in parenting I can respond in a different way. So as just I think this is a plug that we parent, and some of this is not even conscious, and I wanted to name that each of you are already um, really thinking about, it's really that magnifying glass of like, oh, I am already responding to my baby in ways that it's just like as they're doing this, we're like, oh wait, I do want to give a quieter space because that's what I'm seeing my baby show me, right? And so our hope that is that as you are transitioning into your parenthood, or already parenting, that your baby's personhood and who they are in the world will be your companion for it, right? Because parenting is a dance of back and forth, and there's this very like colloquial quote of child is the father of man. And as a parent, I can truly say that I consistently learn from my child on how to parent. And so, set within the culture and within our community. And I just wanted to name that you all bring that consistently with, and your babies bring their personhood into the world and their capacities into the world to really partner with you as you're parenting them. Any other thoughts, questions? Does anybody want to raise their hand and unmute themselves? It would be great to hear somebody's voice. Hara, I think those are questions from me that I held and named. How do we want to do? I want to make space for if there's more questions or comments. It's a great question, Hara. So sharing some more questions that we frequently receive. I think one of the questions was what I named about how paying attention to my baby's cues. I think the other piece was, thinking about, and Kevin named the piece on fatherhood. I think some of maybe one other question that comes to mind for me is, in the realities of COVID, what is this looking like, right? What does transition to parenthood look like with the realities of the global pandemic right now? And that has been a question that has come up consistently right now. And I think something that we've trying to really hold in mind as parents are doing this already, really mixed feelings of ambivalence of joy and excitement and having their baby, and exhaustion, that social isolation or physical isolation, right, is even more profound now. And so I think something that we've consistently tried to hold with parents is to think about what are some ways to support parents. And I think it goes back full circle to like Pankaj's question of like, are there informal support groups? Are there ways of, even if not a support group, like the piece of who can I call upon to to create space for those feelings, right? even if they can't actually come into the home and be with me and my baby with actually extra hands and extra ways of nurturing, who can I reach out to say or talk about this feelings that are coming up as I am transitioning to parenthood, right? The joys, the exhaustion, the tiredness, the like, how did you do this? And so whether, I think it's an invitation that whether it's a friend you call, a grandparent, a neighbor, um, but having during specifically, there's already elevated senses of physical isolation right now, right? What we could typically do, like walk out with our baby for a walk, go to the grocery store and have our baby with us. Some of that looks really different. And I do want to name it, might look really different in different countries based on where response to COVID is. But it's not it's not the usual. And so wanting to just name the importance even more for what does it mean to nurture the nurturer right now, when the sense of social we say physical isolation does not mean emotional isolation. And so how do we find ways to support mothers and fathers in emotional connectedness, so that they feel that they're a part of that we're not parenting on our own right now, even though it feels physically like we are. Yeah. Oh, and Hara, I do see yep, so a little more ideas to explain the handout. So there was a webinar handout for everyone. And I think the handout really elevated, like, what are some ways that we can, what are some ways that we engage in that back and forth with our babies. And so, what the handout talks about is it's through holding, feeding routines, nurturing ways of face-to-face play, talking to our babies, right? Reading with our babies, really picking up on their cues of what are they saying in the moment. And some of those are what we spoke about previously. And so the handout just speaks up to some of those. The video that you all saw is also a way to really highlight that actually when there's a back and forth, right? It's creating patterns and imprints for the baby to say, oh, as I coo, or as I do even a sound, right? Not full like talking, my parent responds to me. And I know that predictable pattern, it's almost like a way of a game, right? Like each of us has a different way of playing with our babies. And this is even pre-verbal, right? Non-verbal ways of playing, right? Whether it's the peekaboos, or even younger, it's the way of like, we see our newborn and we look and we say, hi, hi there, right? That baby knows that this way of being is unique to how my mom interacts with me. It's different from how, say, my father interacts with me. It's different from a provider and my pediatrician interacting with me. And babies know that so soon. They are aware, they have been hearing, and their mom, for even before they're out in this world, they've been hearing their dad's voice even before they're out in this world. And so being able to, the handout just elevates some of those pieces. Thank you for that, Hara. Any other questions? All right. I wanted to really take time to thank you all. I know it is a Sunday evening in the UAE, and really thank you all for joining, being able to. I hope this was helpful, and you will get a link to the video. I wanted to thank Hara, Anastasia, and Alec, and the UAE Child Authority for having us, and the Brazelton Institute for really connecting us, being able to do this together to support, the global community of parents. Thank you, everybody.